You were never abandoned. You were simply the last one to realize that the relationship had already ended a long time ago, not on the day they went silent, not when the messages stopped, but in the smaller moments, the ones you chose to overlook. A reply that came a little later than usual, a conversation that felt slightly empty, the way they said, "I'm busy," and somehow you knew that wasn't the whole truth. But you didn't leave. You stayed. You told yourself, maybe they're going through something. Maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe if I just understand them a little better, things will go back to how they were. And that's where the loop begins. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a subtle shift, repeating itself over and over again. You start paying more attention. You analyze every word. You reread old conversations, trying to figure out what changed. And without realizing it, you're no longer in a relationship. You're in a puzzle you believe that if you just spend enough time solving, you'll finally understand. But there's something no one tells you. You're not stuck because you don't understand them. You're stuck because you're trying to understand something that was never meant to be understood. You begin to feel tired, but you can't explain why. You still care, but it doesn't feel light anymore. It feels like you're carrying something that doesn't belong to you. You wait for them to come back the way they used to be. You wait for the version of them, the one you believe is real. But every time they return, it's just enough to keep you from leaving. And every time they pull away, it's just enough to make you question yourself. That's not love. That's a cycle you don't recognize because it didn't begin with pain. It began with hope. And hope is what keeps you there longer than anything else ever could. You tell yourself you're being patient. You tell yourself you're growing. You tell yourself you're loving the right way. But the truth is, you're slowly learning how to tolerate things you were never meant to accept. And the most dangerous part isn't that they might leave. It's that you start getting used to never really knowing where you stand in someone else's life. You begin to believe that if you're good enough, understanding enough, patient enough, they'll stay. But there's something you haven't realized yet. You're not trying to hold on to a relationship. You're trying to hold on to a version of them that only exists in your mind. And while you're trying to understand them, you're slowly losing yourself. You stop saying what you need. You start adjusting your behavior to be easier to handle. You learn how to stay quiet, even when something inside you is screaming, not because you're weak, but because you feel too deeply. You notice things others don't. You understand what isn't being said, and you believe that if you just stay long enough, they will eventually become the person you see in them. But here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. Not everyone becomes better just because you love them enough, and not every relationship is meant to last. Some relationships exist only to teach you something you've been avoiding for a very long time. That you cannot keep trading your peace for someone else's inconsistency. And if this feels familiar to you, then maybe this isn't the first time you've been in this cycle. It's just the first time you're starting to see it clearly. At first, it doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like something temporary, something you can fix if you just stay a little longer, try a little harder, understand a little deeper. They pull you in, and in those moments, everything feels real again. The attention comes back. The warmth returns. The conversations feel effortless, almost like nothing was ever wrong. And in those moments, you relax. You tell yourself, see, it's still there. This is who they really are. But then, without warning, something shifts. The energy changes. The replies slow down. The presence fades. And suddenly, you're back in that space again, wondering what you did this time. You replay conversations in your head, searching for the exact moment things went wrong. Was it something you said, something you didn't say? Did you come on too strong? Did you expect too much? And the more you think about it, the more it starts to feel like the answer must be you. Because every time they come close, everything feels right. And every time they pull away, you're left holding the weight of confusion alone. So you adjust, you become more careful, you think before you speak, you hold back parts of yourself that might be too much. You try to become easier to love, easier to stay with, easier to not leave. And when they come back again, you don't question it. You accept it. You welcome them like nothing happened. Because for you, connection is more important than consistency. But that's where the loop tightens. They move closer. You feel safe. They pull away. You feel anxious. They return. You feel relief. And your body starts to learn this rhythm, not as logic, but as feeling. You begin to crave the moments when they're present, not realizing that those moments only feel so intense because of how often they disappear. It's not stability, it's contrast. And contrast creates attachment that feels deeper than it actually is. You start checking your phone more often, not because you want to, but because you need to know. You start noticing small details, the way they type, the time they take to respond, the tone in their words. Everything becomes a signal. Everything becomes something to decode. And slowly, without realizing it, your emotional state becomes tied to their behavior. If they're warm, you feel calm. If they're distant, you feel uneasy. If they disappear, you feel like something inside you is collapsing. And in those moments, you don't just miss them. You miss the version of yourself that only seems to exist when they're close. So you wait. You give them space. You tell yourself you're being understanding, that you're respecting their needs. But deep down, you're hoping that if you don't push, they'll come back faster. Hoping that if you stay consistent, they'll eventually match you. And when they do come back, even briefly, it resets everything. All the confusion, all the overthinking, all the quiet frustration, it fades just enough for you to start believing again that this time might be different, that maybe now things will stabilize, but they don't. The cycle repeats, and each time it does, it leaves a mark, not loud enough to break you, but deep enough to change you. You become more anxious, more aware, more dependent on something that never fully stays. And the hardest part is you don't even realize you're in a loop, because every return feels like progress. Every moment of closeness feels like proof that it's working, but it's not progress. It's reinforcement. It's teaching you to stay through inconsistency, to tolerate uncertainty, to accept emotional absence as something normal. And the longer you stay, the more you disconnect from what you actually need. You stop asking, is this healthy for me? And start asking, how do I make this work? And that question changes everything. Because now, instead of evaluating the relationship, you're trying to fix yourself inside it. You become the one who adapts, the one who understands, the one who waits. And they become the one who decides when connection happens. Not because they said it out loud, but because the dynamic slowly placed them there. And the more this repeats, the harder it becomes to leave. Not because you're weak, but because your mind has been trained to associate their presence with relief and their absence with discomfort. And when that happens, you're no longer choosing the relationship, you're responding to it, reacting to it, needing it in a way that doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It feels like something you can't quite step away from, even when you know something about it isn't right. It doesn't start in this relationship. It didn't begin with them. And if you're being honest, the feeling this dynamic creates in you isn't entirely new. There's something familiar about it, not the person, but the pattern. The emotional rhythm of getting close, then losing it. The subtle anxiety of not knowing where you stand. The quiet need to earn consistency instead of expecting it. And that's where most people get it wrong. They think they're reacting to the person in front of them. But what they're actually responding to is something much older, Because on one side of this dynamic, you have someone who craves connection, not in a superficial way, but deeply. You don't just want attention, you want presence. You don't just want someone to be there, you want them to feel you, understand you, meet you at the level you naturally exist at. And when you find even a glimpse of that in someone, it doesn't feel casual to you. It feels significant. It feels rare. It feels like something worth holding on to. But on the other side, there's a completely different internal system operating. Someone who doesn't experience closeness the same way. For them, connection doesn't always feel safe. Intimacy doesn't automatically feel like something to move toward. Sometimes it feels like something to escape from. Not because they don't care, but because closeness triggers something in them that they don't fully understand. And this is where the push and pull begins. When they feel distance, they move closer. When they feel closeness, they pull away. Not consciously, not strategically, but as a learned response. A pattern that was formed long before you ever met them. Maybe in environments where emotional needs weren't consistently met. Maybe in situations where vulnerability led to discomfort instead of safety. So they learned something very specific. That connection is unpredictable. That closeness can shift without warning. That it's safer to stay in control than to fully attach. And that belief doesn't disappear just because they meet someone who's different. It follows them into every interaction, every relationship, including this one. And on your side, there's another pattern running just as quietly. You learned in your own way that love is something you work for. That connection deepens the more you give. The more you understand, the more patient you are, the more you stay even when things feel uncertain. You learned how to read between the lines, how to sense shifts in energy, how to adjust yourself to maintain harmony. Not because you were told to do that directly, but because at some point it became necessary to feel close, necessary to feel secure. So now when you meet someone who pulls away, something activates in you, not just emotionally, but physically. Your nervous system doesn't interpret it as this isn't right for me. It interprets it as I need to try harder, because somewhere along the way, inconsistency became something your system learned to chase, not reject. And when these two patterns meet, they don't cancel each other out. They lock into place perfectly. One person creates distance to feel safe. The other moves closer to restore connection. One person regulates by pulling away. The other regulates by holding on tighter. And neither of you are doing it on purpose. That's what makes it so powerful and so difficult to break, because from the outside, it looks like chemistry. It feels intense. It feels meaningful. It feels like something deeper than ordinary relationships. But intensity is not the same as alignment. And what you're experiencing isn't necessarily compatibility. It's familiarity, familiar patterns, recognizing each other, reinforcing each other, keeping each other in motion. And the longer it continues, the more it starts to feel like something you have to solve. Like if you can just understand them enough, if you can just say the right thing at the right time, if you can just not trigger that distance again, everything will stabilize. But that's not how this works, because you're not dealing with surface level behavior. You're dealing with internal systems that were built over years, systems designed to protect, not connect. And protection doesn't disappear just because connection is present. It overrides it. So every time things start to get closer, their system responds by creating space. And every time that space appears, your system responds by trying to close it. And without realizing it, both of you are maintaining the very dynamic that's exhausting you, not because either of you want it, but because neither of you have learnt another way. And this is the part most people never fully see, that the relationship feels the way it does, not because of what's happening on the surface, but because of what's happening underneath it, in the nervous system, in the patterns that were formed before either of you had a choice. And until that's understood, it doesn't matter how much effort you put in, because effort alone cannot override a pattern that was built for survival. This is the part no one tells you. This is the part that changes everything once you see it clearly. Because up until now, you've been operating under one assumption, that if you just try a little harder, understand a little deeper, stay a little longer, something will eventually shift, that their distance is temporary, that their inconsistency is something you can work through. That beneath all of it, there's a stable version of them waiting to emerge. And if you just hold on long enough, you'll reach it. But what if that's not what's happening at all? What if you're not in the process of building something, but actually being kept inside something? Because this dynamic you're in, it doesn't just affect your thoughts, it rewires your emotional responses, it conditions your system in a very specific way. Every time they pull away, it creates a drop, a sense of loss, a subtle discomfort that you feel in your body before you even put words to it. And every time they come back, it creates relief, not just emotionally, but chemically. Your system registers it as safety returning, as something being restored. And over time, your mind starts to associate them with that relief. Not with stability, not with consistency, but with the release of tension they themselves created. And that's where the trap forms. Because now you're no longer just attached to them. You're attached to the cycle of losing them and getting them back. The distance creates longing. The return creates reward. And that reward feels stronger every time because it follows discomfort. This is not connection. This is conditioning. And the more it repeats, the deeper it embeds itself. You start to crave the moments when things feel good, not realizing that those moments are only intensified by how often they disappear. If they were consistent, those same moments wouldn't feel nearly as powerful, but inconsistency amplifies everything. It makes small amounts of attention feel like something significant. It makes brief moments of closeness feel like proof of something real. And that's why you stay, not because the relationship is stable, but because the emotional highs feel too meaningful to ignore. But those highs don't come from alignment. They come from contrast. And contrast is what creates dependency, because your system learns something very quickly. That relief comes from them. The discomfort goes away when they return. So instead of questioning the source of the discomfort, you start chasing the relief. And this is where the illusion becomes strongest. You tell yourself, I just need to be patient. I just need to not push them. I just need to show them I'm consistent. But what you're actually doing is adapting to the cycle instead of stepping outside of it. You're learning how to survive the inconsistency instead of questioning why it exists. And slowly, your standards begin to shift. Things that once felt unacceptable start to feel normal. Silence becomes expected. Distance becomes understandable. Emotional absence becomes something you tolerate instead of challenge. And all the while, you believe you're being mature. You believe you're giving space. You believe you're allowing things to unfold naturally, but in reality, you're being trained to accept less, trained to stay in uncertainty, trained to find meaning in inconsistency. And the most dangerous part is it doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like something worth fighting for because the connection feels intense. It feels different. It feels like there's something deeper there that just hasn't fully surfaced yet. But intensity is not depth, and struggle is not proof that something is meaningful. Sometimes struggle is just a sign that something is misaligned. But the cycle makes it hard to see that, because every time you get close to stepping away, they come back just enough, just at the right moment, and that return resets everything. It brings back the hope. It brings back the belief that things are finally changing. But they're not changing. They're repeating. And the reason it feels so hard to leave isn't because the relationship is strong. It's because the pattern is. Because your system has been conditioned to expect the return, to wait for it, to hold on just a little longer because it's happened before. But here's the truth most people never confront. You're not staying because it's working. You're staying because it almost works. And almost is one of the most powerful forms of attachment there is, because it keeps you in a constant state of anticipation, always close enough to believe, but never close enough to feel secure. And as long as you stay in that space, the cycle continues, not because you want it to, but because everything about it is designed to keep you there. There's always a moment, not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of moment you can point to and say, that's when everything changed. It's quieter than that, subtle, almost easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But it's the moment where something inside you stops trying in the same way. You're still there, you're still responding, you're still engaging, but something has shifted beneath the surface and you don't notice it immediately. At first, it just feels like exhaustion, like you don't have the same energy to analyze every message. You don't feel the same urgency to fix every distance. You still care, but it feels heavier now, less instinctive, less automatic. And then, slowly, something else begins to happen. You start seeing things you couldn't fully see before, not because they changed, but because you did. The same patterns that once confused, you now feel familiar. The same behaviors you used to justify now feel predictable. The same cycle that once pulled you in now starts to feel repetitive. And that's when the question changes. It's no longer, what did I do wrong? It becomes, why does this keep happening? And that question is dangerous, not because it hurts, but because it leads somewhere you can't unsee. Because once you start looking at the pattern instead of the moments, everything becomes clearer. You realize that the connection you've been holding on to hasn't really been evolving. It's been repeating. The closeness wasn't building towards something stable. It was resetting the cycle. The distance wasn't an exception. It was part of the structure. And for the first time, you stop looking at the highlights and start looking at the whole picture. Not just when they show up, but how often they disappear. Not just what they say, but what they consistently fail to do. Not just how it feels when it's good, but how it feels most of the time. And when you see it like that, something shifts in a way that isn't emotional. It's cognitive. It's clarity. And clarity doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels uncomfortable because it forces you to confront something you've been avoiding, that this might not become what you hoped it would, that the version of them you've been holding on to isn't the version that consistently shows up, that the effort you've been putting in isn't creating change, it's maintaining the cycle. And for a moment you resist it. You go back to old thoughts. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe they just need more time. Maybe this is just a phase. But something about those thoughts doesn't land the same anymore because now you've seen the pattern. And once you see a pattern clearly, you can't go back to seeing it as random. You can't convince yourself it's temporary when it's been consistent. You can't call it confusion when it's been repeating. And this is where the real shift begins, not when you stop caring, but when caring is no longer enough to override what you understand. You still feel the pull, you still feel the attachment, but now it exists alongside something else, awareness. And awareness changes how everything feels. The same behaviors that once triggered anxiety now trigger recognition. The same distance that once made you chase now makes you pause. The same return that once gave you relief now feels temporary. And that's when something unexpected happens. You stop trying to fix it, not because you don't want it to work, but because you no longer believe it will work the way you imagined. And that belief is what was driving everything before. The hope that if you just stayed consistent, something would eventually stabilize. But now that hope starts to weaken, not completely, not all at once, but enough for you to start asking a different question. Not how do I make this work, but why am I staying in something that keeps repeating the same outcome? And that question changes everything, because it brings the focus back to you, not what they're doing, not what they might become, but what you're experiencing and what you're choosing. And for the first time, you start to see that the problem was never just the person. It was the dynamic, the interaction between two patterns that kept reinforcing each other. And once you see that, you realize something even deeper, that no matter how much effort you put in, you can't change a dynamic that requires both people to change. And that realization doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels heavy because it removes the illusion of control. It takes away the idea that if you just do things differently, you'll get a different outcome. And without that illusion, you're left with a truth that's much harder to sit with, that this might be exactly what it is. Not a phase, not a misunderstanding, not something waiting to become better, just a pattern repeating itself. And in that moment, something inside you becomes very still, not because you've made a decision yet, but because for the first time, you're no longer confused. This is where everything starts to change, but not in the way most people expect, because reclaiming your power doesn't look like a sudden decision. It doesn't look like you waking up one day completely detached, completely unaffected, completely over it. It's quieter than that, slower, more internal. It begins the moment you stop asking how to make the connection work and start asking what it's costing you to stay. And at first that question feels uncomfortable because for so long, your focus has been outward. What they need, what they feel, what they might be going through. You've trained yourself to understand, to adapt, to hold space even when it wasn't being held for you. So turning that focus back onto yourself feels unfamiliar, almost unnatural. But that's exactly where the shift begins, not in controlling them, not in changing the dynamic directly, but in changing your relationship to it. You start noticing things you didn't allow yourself to fully register before, how your mood shifts depending on their presence, how much energy you spend trying to interpret their behavior, how often you silence your own needs just to keep the connection stable. And instead of just accepting it, you pause, not to analyze them, but to observe yourself. And that observation creates space between what they do and how you respond to it. And that space is where your power lives. Because for the first time, you're no longer reacting automatically. You're seeing the pattern as it happens. When they pull away, you feel the familiar urge to reach out, to fix, to restore. But now there's a moment, however small, where you hesitate, not because you don't care, but because you recognize the pattern. And that hesitation is everything, because it breaks the automatic loop. It gives you a choice where before there was only reaction. And at first that choice feels uncomfortable, almost wrong, because you've associated love with effort for so long. You've believed that showing up means staying consistent no matter what. That understanding means tolerating inconsistency. But now you begin to question that. You begin to see that constantly overriding your own needs isn't love, it's self-abandonment. And once that realization starts to settle in, something inside you begins to recalibrate. You stop chasing clarity from them. You stop waiting for the right explanation, the right moment, the right version of them to appear. And instead you start trusting what you've already seen, not the promises, not the potential, but the pattern. And trusting the pattern changes how you move. You don't feel the same urgency to respond immediately. You don't feel the same need to explain yourself in ways they may or may not understand. You don't feel the same pull to keep everything smooth at your own expense. Not because you've become cold, but because you've become aware. And awareness naturally creates distance from things that are misaligned. You begin to understand something deeper about boundaries, that they're not about controlling someone else's behavior. They're about controlling your exposure to it. It's not about making them communicate better. It's about deciding what you will engage with. It's not about forcing consistency. It's about recognizing when it isn't there and choosing accordingly. And that shift is subtle, but powerful, because it moves you out of a reactive state into a grounded one. You're no longer trying to stabilize something unstable. You're stabilizing yourself. And that changes everything. You start valuing your peace in a way you didn't before. You start noticing how much calmer you feel when you're not constantly anticipating their next move. You begin to reconnect with parts of yourself that were quiet for a long time, the part that knows what feels right, the part that doesn't need to overanalyze to feel secure, the part that understands that consistency is not something you earn, it's something that's either present or it's not. And as that connection to yourself strengthens, something else weakens. The hold the dynamic had on you, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, the emotional intensity starts to fade. The urgency starts to soften. The need to fix starts to dissolve. And what replaces it isn't indifference. It's clarity with boundaries. You still see them for who they are. You still understand their patterns. But now that understanding doesn't pull you closer. It allows you to step back because you finally recognize that empathy without boundaries is what kept you stuck in the first place. And this time you're not abandoning yourself to maintain a connection. You're choosing yourself, even if it means the connection changes. And that's what reclaiming your power actually looks like. Not becoming someone else, but returning to the version of you that no longer needs to shrink, adjust, or overextend, just to feel chosen. And then one day, something happens that doesn't look like a breakthrough, but changes everything. You notice that you're no longer waiting the same way. The silence that used to feel unbearable now just feels quiet. The distance that once triggered anxiety now feels like information. And the absence that used to make you question your worth no longer carries the same weight. Not because they changed, but because you did. Because somewhere along the way, without a dramatic moment, without a final conversation, without closure in the way you once imagined, you stopped needing it. You stopped needing them to explain. You stopped needing them to choose you in order to feel chosen. You stopped needing the cycle to resolve in order for you to move forward. And that's the shift most people don't understand until they experience it themselves. You don't reach this point by forcing yourself to detach. You don't get here by pretending you don't care. You get here by seeing clearly for long enough that the illusion can no longer hold. And once that happens, something inside you reorganizes, your priorities shift, your tolerance changes. The things you once fought to keep no longer feel aligned with who you're becoming. And it's not dramatic. You're not angry. You're not resentful. You're just done participating in something that no longer makes sense to you. And that kind of detachment is different. It's not reactive. It's not emotional in the way it used to be. It's steady, quiet, certain. You look at the same person and instead of feeling pulled in, you feel distance, not forced distance, natural distance, the kind that doesn't require effort to maintain because it's not something you're doing. It's something you've become. And maybe they come back again. Maybe they reach out in the same way they always have, the same timing, the same energy, the same pattern that used to pull you right back in. But this time, it doesn't land the same. You see it for what it is. Not a new beginning, not a sign of change, just another repetition. And for the first time, you don't respond from habit, you respond from awareness. Or maybe you don't respond at all. And that's when you realize something you couldn't fully understand before. That closure was never something they were going to give you. It was something that formed inside you the moment you stopped expecting them to become someone different. The moment you accepted what was consistently there instead of holding on to what could be. And that acceptance doesn't feel like loss. It feels like clarity. Because now you're no longer divided between what you feel and what you know. They match. And when that happens, the internal conflict disappears. You're not trying to convince yourself anymore. You're not negotiating with your own intuition. You're not overriding your needs in the name of potential. You're aligned. And alignment creates a kind of peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's behavior. It doesn't require consistency from them because you've become consistent with yourself. And from the outside, it might look like you've changed suddenly, like you just decided one day to walk away. But you know the truth. This didn't happen in a day. This was built over every moment you paid attention, every time you chose awareness over illusion, every time you stopped ignoring what didn't feel right. And now you don't need to explain it. You don't need to justify it. You don't need them to understand it, because for the first time, you do. And maybe the most unexpected part of all of this is not that you let them go. It's that you no longer feel the urge to hold on. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you're not waiting for them to come back. And maybe without even realizing it, you wouldn't want them to.